Okay, so in Maya, we have actually a technique that allows us to break or destroy objects. A couple things I should mention though. Whenever you have to want to destroy an object, it needs to be essentially closed. So there should be no open spots. The mesh should be clean. So I'm going to just take this headstone as an example. Mesh has to be basically clean. It could be tris or quads, but again, nothing over 5 sides. And I've noticed people are doing this a lot with their mesh. They're leaving a lot of vertices behind and 5-sided plus mesh. It's not really the ideal way to model. It leaves things really messy and disorganized. But the other thing is, there's this tool in Maya called the Shatter tool, and it requires that the mesh be frozen, so you have to freeze transforms and you have to delete history. So my suggested technique for this is to actually go to modify, freeze transforms first. Alright, so it zeroes out any XYZ translation and scaling. And then you also have to delete history. So for me, the shortcut on that is Alt-Shift-D, or you can go to Edit, Delete History. So there's the two things you have to make sure of, is that you delete that. So once that's done, you can go into the upper left corner of Maya. There's different drop downs for animation, for modeling. We're actually going to go to the Effects menu. And inside of that, you'll find another menu over here in the middle of the menu bar called Effects, and then you're going to go to Shatter. So there's 3 types. There's a surface shatter, a crack shatter. I pretty much always use the solid shatter. And you can tell it, you can give it a base name too, so you can call it Tombstone Shatter _. And then you've basically got the count, which is the number of pieces, the shard count, jaggedness. So when it creates broken pieces, the interior faces that it creates are going to be rough or jagged. So this is usually on the scale of centimeters, I believe. So I mean, I think this object is about 3 feet tall. So you can leave a rough jaggedness. For me, this level I think works okay. I've tested it out already. You can tell it to triangulate the surface or not to. So I sort of warn you guys against anything below or above 4-sided polys. There are exceptions to this, and this would be one exception. So when you have damaged surfaces, organic surfaces, cloth simulation, a lot of times you actually want triangulation, especially if it winds up being a little bit more random and chaotic, because triangles fit those rougher, more organic and chaotic surfaces better than a more grid-like system like our quads layout. So I usually go with triangulated surface, and then you can tell it to apply an interior material. So what will happen is I believe it generates a second material. So a lot of times, let's say you've got an exterior concrete surface or a painted surface, so that could be one material, and then the interior material could be something different. It looks different on the inside than it does on the outside. So I often like to set that option up as well. And lastly, the surface. You may want to hide the original surface or delete it. I usually just want it out of the scene, so I tend to just leave the delete option on. And if it's a problem, I'll undo and try it again in a different way. So those are basically the settings that I prefer to use. And then I'll just simply hit create. So it'll take a few seconds, and if we take a look, let me go to object mode so we can see this better. Now we've got beautiful busted pieces of our mesh, right? So this works really, really great. I tried doing some physics simulations in Maya. I'm not an expert in it yet, but getting the pieces to kind of fall and then lay on the ground naturally, it's really problematic from what I've seen so far in Maya, but I'll see if I can find a way to get that to work better. Worst case scenario, basically, you can move these pieces and kind of eyeball it and lay this stuff on the ground, right? So just get it to roughly feel like it's in contact, solid contact with the ground, to lay these pieces down. So a little bit of moving, rotating. So that's one really great way to get destruction into your scene. And somebody else asked me, what happens if you have a wood plank? Well, wood planks are a little different, mainly because the style of damage that happens with them is they tend to get splintered. So I'll load a couple of images for you guys. Shattered wood. So yeah, wood is a little bit complicated. Like this stuff, if you notice in Maya, it's all kind of regular chunks. Like there aren't things that go lengthwise. So if I go back to, yeah, Google here. So if you notice, realistic looking wood will have, so there's a grain to wood, and wood tends to split along the grain, right? So that's the length of the, I guess, the internal fibers that feed water throughout the plant, right? So the grain tends to run vertically up and down along the trunk and along the length of branches and stuff like that. And this is end grain, right, where you're seeing kind of the ends of the fibers or whatever, the grain. So yeah, shattered wood tends to crack and splinter in this sort of lengthwise fashion. So I sort of found a little cheat for this the other day. So if you have or want to create a wood plank, let me just start with one of these guys over here. So I'll make this thing about 5 centimeters wide, maybe 3 tall, and then I'm going to make it shorter than I would, so I'll explain why in a second. Let's do, I don't know, like 20, maybe 40 actually. So if I wanted the piece to actually be this length, right, I would actually probably scale it down to this size, mainly so that I can get those longer looking shards and pieces. So I'm going to make it short and then scale the shattered pieces afterwards. So again, we go to Modify, Freeze Transforms. And again, that is a history input, right? So that's why I delete history at the end. So freeze transforms, then we can delete history. Alt-Shift-D, right? And again, I'll just go back to Effects, Shatter. I'll use roughly the same settings. This is okay. So I'll call this wood or plank. It's probably a little bit shorter and easier to look at. Go to Create. It's going to shatter. Again, I'll go back to Object Mode. So, right, so we got these pieces again. They're more regular, or I mean not quite regular, but they're more sort of evenly dispersed. But what happens is if we take all this stuff and scale it, right, once you get it to the length that you want it to be, well, now this thing looks like shards and splinters, right? So that's kind of my little trick to get shattered wood if you want to try something like that. And somebody asked me too, you know, if you wanted to maybe weld some pieces together, you can do that, but so you get more solid pieces and then smaller chunks. You may want to try a different type of shatter for that, which would be the surface shatter. But then you'd have to go through and kind of fill in the interior faces, because it would only just keep the sort of thin shell of the object and put like lines or cracks through it. But anyways, yeah, this should work good for most situations, right? If you need damage. And if you want specific parts to be damaged, you know, let's say we take these guys. I'm going to split this off into its own object, so I'll just extract this out. I'll do the same thing with these faces as well. So I'll take, let's say, this top piece and extract that. So I'll hit, let's go to Object Mode. I'll hit Control-1 to isolate. And again, we need closed objects, right? So I'll go to Edge Mode and then Fill Hole. Again, freeze transform. So it's going to be a very repetitive process, but freeze transforms, effect, shatter. I'm only going to do a couple of chunks in this case. So we'll go solid shatter again. I'll do like 3-4 chunks, let's say. Oh, by the way, so I went to isolation mode. I just want to show you this too. I've noticed this is an issue. If I hit Control-1, what's happening is Maya on the left-hand side here actually creates kind of a quick selection set or quick view set. I think this is a problem for the shatter tool, so I may in fact actually just have to get out of that isolation mode. And if it's already within a group, again, it doesn't like objects within groupings. So I'm going to pull this thing out, and again, I'm just going to make sure this is still frozen. Just delete history just in case. Effect and shatter. Hopefully this will still work. Yeah. Sometimes I will warn you guys about this. The shatter tool is extremely touchy. So if it doesn't work in inside of Maya, that's okay. Since you're bringing this stuff into Zbrush, I can show you guys a technique in Zbrush that works really great. So yeah, let's just isolate one of these stones here. Okay, so I'll grab that. Just go to solo. And again, I'll split these parts off. So if I hit Shift F, by the way, as you may or may not remember, is activating polyframes, which is like a wireframe, and it shows you a color coding. So the color coding is what's known as a polygroup. Polygroups are basically a ZBrush invention, but you can use polygroups to generate UVs. You can use them to organize your mesh for visibility, as I mentioned last class. And in this case, I don't really care about creating polygroups, but I will split this to parts. So it's going to split this single subtool into two separate subtools. So I'll go split to parts. So now each little column for this gate is on its own, in its own subtool. And there's a few ways that we can get this mesh to look damaged. So I'm going to talk about this as an overall sort of idea. You can use divisions. So I talked about this last week where we can divide the geometry, but as you see, it sort of rounds stuff out. So we can turn off smoothing and divide a few times. The problem with divisions, I'll say, is that as soon as you start sculpting or wanting to make a major change, sometimes you get restricted in terms of what you can do in ZBrush. So for destructed or damaged environments, especially in these smaller pieces, I like to use Dynamesh. I usually don't mix subdividing and Dynamesh. I usually go one way or the other. In this case, I'm going to hit Dynamesh, and you can see it looks really, really rough. This is an issue of resolution. So what I'm going to do is bump up the resolution slider and then hit Dynamesh. And you see it actually looks pretty decent. What's kind of nice about it too is actually if you come at it with a low enough resolution, high enough to get the general details, but low enough to kind of mess up the edges, it's actually not a terrible start to creating damage, right? May have showed you guys last week trim dynamic. So if you come in with trim dynamic, you can kind of damage and wear off some of the edges on your object. So this is kind of just a pure sculptural way to damage stuff. But I'm going to undo one more time. I'm going to bump the slider up a little bit higher when I go to Dynamesh. Also, when I'm Dynameshing, I often look to the active points. So, you know, for something at this level, I don't need something super high res. Just sort of high enough to get some damage and detail in. All right, so this is another great kind of technique that a lot of people use. They kind of, you know, damage and rough up the corners at a starting point, right? Kind of wear down those edges. So again, this is the trim dynamic brush, which I have set up at the bottom here. Or you can go B for brush, T for trim dynamic, and then you'll find it here in the brush palette. And again, I usually kind of come at it with a bunch of strokes, so it's uneven, it's irregular, it's not perfectly symmetrical. So that's just doing some damage. Now if we want to do cracks and other sorts of damage, I want to show you this little tool. So by default, when you hold Control-Shift, right, so when you hold Control, it activates a different brush. It's an alternate brush mode essentially. So your regular brush, right, is whatever brush you've selected. When you hold Control, you're basically activating the mask pen tool, which allows you to mask an area or clear the mask. If you hold Shift, it activates a smoothing brush, right? So it's actually technically activating a separate brush. And when you hold Control-Shift, it actually activates this thing called the Select Rectangle. So a lot of times I use this to isolate a part of the mesh, hide or unhide parts of the mesh. So Control-Shift, drag over a part of the mesh will make that area visible. If I hold Alt down though, it'll hide that part of the mesh, right? And then Control-Shift tap off will unhide everything. So that's Select Rectangle. And oftentimes, you know, I will switch the stroke type to lasso so I can get something a little bit more controlled, right, and specific. Now the reason I bring that up is that there are three ways to kind of chip off or split or kind of divide the mesh into different parts, kind of like the shatter tool in Maya. So the first tool I want to show you, which is kind of a standard that I use for concept work, is called Clip Curve. Now, what happens when you click on Clip Curve is that it says the brush selected will be the active quote-unquote selection brush, meaning that when you hold Control-Shift, this will now be the brush that loads instead of the selection tool, right? So instead of getting that green selection area, the red, now I get, for some reason, again, this is a weird ZBrush quirk, when you first drag out in this Clip Curve mode, it gives you just this weird white box, but you have to undo, or not undo, sorry, but let go of Control Shift, try it again, and now you get this kind of line, right? So what that does is actually allows you to take a part of the mesh and kind of flatten it. It actually doesn't remove it, but it flattens it against that line. And the way it basically works, it's a little strange, but Control Shift click and drag, or Control Shift pen drag, right? If you hold Control Shift down and you're moving your mouse or your pen around, it's snapping on 5-degree increments, but if you let go, it's a free-form angle tool. And if you notice, there's a shaded line to one side. So what that basically means is the stuff on the shaded side of the line will be flattened down against that dashed line. So I think when you draw from top to bottom, the shading's on the right. When you draw from bottom to top, the shading's on the left. If you go left to right, the shading is one way, and if you go right to left, it's the other way. So right top to bottom, the shading is on the right. If I undo, Control Shift, click and drag from below up, now the shading's on the left, right? So that's how that tool basically works. If I hit Alt, I can get a curved line. If I double tap, I can get a jagged edge. It's pretty cool, right? Now, one problem with this is clip curve, okay? So that's just flattening the mesh. So sometimes you get these weird little lips of mesh, so you might have to smooth them out to kind of fix that issue. But I'm going to show you two kind of variations on the same brush. So if I go to B for brush, C for clip curve, there's a regular clip curve, there's a clip rectangle, there's a clip circle center. Quite honestly, I only ever use the clip curve out of those, and there's a clip circle. So I'll show you this. If I Control Shift click and drag the circle, now it will, right, only keep that area visible. It's really, again, I don't use that one a lot, but so that's the clip curve or clip style brushes. We also have so I'll go B for brush, T for trim, and we've actually got something similar. There's a trim lasso, there's a trim curve, a trim circle. I'll go trim curve, again, using roughly the same tool as before, and again, it warns you the Control Shift keys will now switch to this trim curve brush. So what does trim do? If I click this, it actually removes that piece of mesh and fills in the area of the opening. So you don't get the weird excess stuff that you might get with clip curve, and you get a separate polygroup, which is useful. So why would this be useful? Well, let's I'm going to crank up my Dynamesh resolution so I can sculpt some detail. So what's great about this is now I can, let's say, I'm going to Control Shift tap on this polygroup and then flip that around. Okay. So I've got a higher resolution mesh. Now I can, let's say I just want to put a quick pattern on this. So I'm going to switch to a standard brush, and I'll switch to, let's say, color spray. And just to add a kind of texture, a rough kind of concrete texture, I'll go with these kind of dots. Now the scale on that's not quite right, so let me bring the scale down, and I'll turn the intensity down as well. Right, so I'll just kind of put a little bit of texture, right, just kind of spraying this in. Yeah, I'll answer your question in a sec, Mark.
Oh, it was just if you close the line school.
So now I've got a little bit of texture. Now, one thing I'll mention too, the resolution of this is a bit low, and even if I Dynamesh this really high, I'd probably need this thing to get to at least 500,000 polys for some additional detailing, so I'll come back around to that in a second. But what's great about this is that if I Control Shift click on this, now I can go in and put some other damage in here. So I'm going to load or find one of my my brushes here. I've got something called the damage kit. So I'm going to go click on my brush tool, load a brush, damage kit, and this thing, it has kind of this splotchy damage, and if I drag this out, you see it kind of does this, right? So now you may want to be careful about this, by the way, because sometimes the borders are a little bit strange with this. And if I hit Shift F, just to go back to this for a second, polygroups, right? So this green area is one polygroup, the blue is another. So that trim brush automatically gave me a new polygroup, which is really, really useful. So now what I can do is if I go grab either one of the move, scale, rotate tools, which is just like the Maya shortcuts, W is move, E is scale, R is rotate. So I'll go maybe just W. Control tap on a polygroup, it instantly masks every other polygroup but the one you've just tapped on. So now if I go back to this damage brush and drag this out, I get a better degree of control, and if I want to blur the borders a little bit, I can Control tap on the edge of that mask, and now I can get a better bleeding effect between the two polygroups, right? So now we get this really awesome, right, combo of damage. So as you can see, I mean, maybe in a sense, Zbrush is a little bit more powerful than mine in this way. It can really do a lot of amazing stuff. So for me, I find I often have to do a little bit of touch-up work on the borders of this stuff, so I may have to trim off parts of this, right, just to kind of get the damage to move back, because it sort of overwent the border. Sometimes I play with the masking a bit. But yeah, hopefully this gives you guys a few ideas about what you can do with your objects. So I'll go back a little bit in time here, pre-slice, pre-trim. So that's trim. So trim, actually, when you draw the line, trim curve, right? Right. So even if I double click and do that, you know, it basically removes that piece on the one side and gives you a new polygroup. If you want to keep the chunk that you're removing, though, or if you want to kind of do your own handmade shatter, you can go to B for brush and S for slice. This is really awesome. I think this is probably my favorite tool for environment stuff. So I'll go to the slice curve, and again, there's slice circle, slice rectangle, but I'm going to go to slice curve. So what slice curve does, and again, same controls, right? Alt, double Alt tap is a sharp edge. One Alt tap is a curve line. It doesn't actually do much, but it actually splits the object into two polygroups, right? So now you can quickly isolate, but there's no fill area. So I'll show you what I would do with this. So let's say I'm working in my scene. I'm going to go to Subtool, and on this particular piece, I'm going to say Group Split. So Group Split is, so it's in the Subtool palette, right? Subtool Group Split. That will split these two parts. Okay, so now we've got the base of this gate stand or whatever that's there, and then the sort of chunk that's left over. And what I can simply do now is go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Close Holes. And then I'll go back to the other piece, Modify Topology, Geometry, Modify Topology. So it's under Modify Topology, and then Close Holes. So now we can do pretty much the exact same thing that I did earlier, which is to go in. I can move this piece now, since I'm on this piece. By the way, a lot of people do not like the Move, Scale, Rotate tool. My basic way of working with it is to almost always drag out. So when you initially left-click and drag out, you've got 3 lines, right? In the case of the Move tool, the middle line allows you to move the object kind of down. And it's essentially like a freeform pivot tool, and I can squash if I grab the end point. So the end point is the one that has the little white dot next to it, but if I grab the front point, I can actually almost like a trim or a clip curve, flatten that mesh, but in this case I don't want to do that. If I go to rotate, left click and drag, and I usually, again, hold shift so it aligns it to the kind of world axis basically, and then I can rotate this piece down. So it's a freeform pivot. If you grab the outer points, it's there to allow you to change the pivots on the fly, and the inner points at the ends of the rotate tool allow you to rotate, right? So now I could do my sculpting just as I did. I could drag out an alpha. So alphas are really powerful. Just to show you this again, this damage kit, it basically has a really great alpha that I'm not sure if it was sculpted or if it was just grabbed from like a photo, but you can see in the little preview what it does. Again, I'll quickly switch to the this isolation tool, right? So I'll go Move, Scale, Rotate, Control Tap on the polygroup, and then if I switch back to the damage kit brush in this case, right, I can kind of take care of some damage. I'm going to clear the mask. So I'm going to solo this piece. My scene's a little slow too, just because I think that mausoleum building is like 25 million polys still, so I may want to reduce that down or optimize it. And I'll come back to that topic in a bit too. So for this piece, I'm going to maybe try to crank the resolution again. Control, click, and drag. It's not terrible, and I can go to a maximum. So maybe I'll just Control, click, and drag again. So unfortunately, I can only get to about 37,000 polys with Dynamesh at the maximum resolution. So if you ever get limited by this, one thing I recommend doing, turn off Dynamesh. You can go to Geometry, Z-Remesh, and so let me show you that again. It's in Geometry and then Z-Remesh. What Z-Remesh will do is basically create a new, more organized piece of mesh or model. This is one of the great things about ZBrush is you can go from a Dynamesh model to a more organized, more proper Z-remesh to something else. I'll talk about Decimation Master later in terms of optimizing your scenes, because these things can get really heavy really quick. But we can jump back and forth between mesh types without necessarily losing any of the data or information that we have. So in this case, I don't have a ton of data. It's just a basic blocky shape. But I do want to keep the polygroups. So there's a really convenient option here called Keep Groups. And basically what Z-remesh will do is give me a new base poly count that I'll probably just use divisions for to get more resolution and more detail. So I'm okay with 5,000 polys, and then I'm going to hit Z-remesh. So it'll keep the two different groups, and it will generate a new, more organized model that should follow these lines and profile a lot better, right? So in this case, I wouldn't go back to Dynamesh. I would actually simply go into Divide and hit Divide once, twice, 3, maybe 4, 5, 6 times, depending. So I'm at, just for this chunk, actually, I'm at 1.7 million. That might be a bit much. I'm going to delete the higher. But now, if I, again, go Move, Scale, Rotate, Control Tap on that poly group, switch back to my damage kit, you'll see so much more detail, right? And again, I may Control Tap on this to blur the mask a little bit, just to blur the edges and adjust my intensity down just a little bit, right? So now I can work on that. I mean, that looks really great, right? I can hold Alt and alter this damage a bit, so some parts are sticking out, others are pulling in. Right? It starts to look really convincing really quickly, yeah? And if I Control Tap to reverse the mask, well, now maybe I can go in with, and you want to be careful, because sometimes I find you get these ultra thin edges, so sometimes I find I have to either smooth these out. And by the way, I should mention this as well. When you're working in high res, your smoothing brush doesn't work as effectively in ultra high res as it does at lower resolutions. So sometimes I'll go to lower resolution and sort of fix some of that stuff. So yeah, we want to try to avoid this sort of tearing through, which is what's happening. And I may in fact just clear the masking to deal with some of this stuff. So I'm going to Control, Click, and Drag to clear the mask there, and I'll sort of smooth out fix some of these rough edges a bit. And then I'll come at them probably with a trim dynamic, right? So chip away at the edges. So yeah, I mentioned last class you can get this this kit. It's called the XMD brushes. They're really great. I highly recommend them. There's a bunch of freebies as well online. So yeah, masking polygroups. I mean, it's really effective. These sort of ideas and techniques. They're really useful for isolating areas and creating different styles of damage, right? Because I may want cracks in some areas and I may want something else in other areas. So let's just kind of hammer away at this. If I step up in resolution too, that's what's great. I often like to work low res and then jump back and forth, because I find sometimes the low res, shortcut by the way for going low res is Shift D when you have subdivisions, and D goes up in divisions. So that's my quick sort of shortcut. Well, that's actually a ZBrush shortcut, but so now we can kind of damage the edges here, right? Make it nice and rough. It's sort of similar for cracks too. So let me go up to a little bit higher resolution. So a lot of times you can go in with a damn standard brush. So I might go in with a little bit lighter intensity, and you can also switch the alpha on this too. Like this one is fairly spread out, so I may go with something a little bit more focused. I'll try maybe this one. Yeah, a little bit larger draw size. Actually, let me just switch back. So let me, I'll reset my brushes here. Damn standard. So I'll show you. This is kind of a really simple technique. So you can go with the damn standard. Watch the depth or the intensity. You don't necessarily want it to go firing through the mesh and stretching the polys. But then after, it's the same sort of idea. We go in and start hammering this, kind of hitting it multiple times, multiple strokes with the trim dynamic. And it starts to give you these like kind of jagged, rough edges, right, that look fairly convincing. You can also use alphas. So if you get a photo image of a crack, sorry, let me grab one here. So let's just say crack alpha. With ZBrush too, I'm going to recommend, if you do get alphas, or if you make your own, so you can Photoshop these where you just, blast the contrast, you make adjustments to the image. And unfortunately, a lot of these are kind of watermarked, but yeah, normally I just find an actual image or take my own photos and then just Photoshop them, right? But I'll save you guys the long demo. Yeah, try to find something here. Don't want shattered glass either, like, yeah. So maybe something like this would work. And I usually like to go as high res as possible. Yeah, somebody even asked me the other day, like, peeling paint or like peeling paint. You can actually do the same thing with paint, So if you have an image, again, you don't want something too close up. You usually want something that's a full wall view if you want to do a lot, or something that may have enough detail in it that you can texture it. So these can basically be photoshopped and brought in. Anyways, I'll just try to bring one of these in that has, has a good texture. Let's say cracked concrete. Perfect. Nice. All right, so I'll copy this image. Yeah, the basic way I Photoshop it will usually be with levels, maybe a little bit of blurring, because sometimes when the contrast is too high, you get kind of really pixelated looking images. And what's great about this stuff too is that ZBrush accepts alphas as PSDs. So if you have an original image that you want to keep, you can basically do this in a series of adjustment layers. So adjustment layer, levels, there we go. So I'm going to just make this really high contrast as much as possible. And then, let's see, I'll take a wand. Or maybe just a large brush, it's probably better. All right. Okay, so yeah, I'll just maybe do this on a layer above. There we go, just kind of paint this stuff out. Because I'm really focused on the crack. I don't want the texture back there, I want just the crack. Sweet, sweet crack. Okay. Now, what's interesting too is if you go into this image, you can. I usually like to use a dodge and burn on this. So if you guys aren't familiar with it, dodge and burn. Dodge is used to lighten areas, and then burn is used to darken areas. And you can tell it what areas to affect. So I can affect midtones, shadows. In this case, I really just want to affect the shadow regions mostly. So I can get a nice solid crevice, like so. And then I can go switch to the dodge and affect maybe midtones and highlights. So I can try to just clean up those little speckled areas near the crack. There we go. So I'll just work on that a little bit. And ZBrush, ZBrush is a little picky sometimes when it comes to alphas and stuff. So sometimes I'll put a little, basically it's like a little, how would I put this? I guess kind of a blurred mask to this, so we get a little bit of fading. So if I create a new level above this, I'm going to just draw a marquee. Yeah, let's do a marquee selection. I'll then go to filter, and this is pretty high res. I think it's around 2,000 pixels. So I'll go to selection, modify feather by like maybe 50 pixels. And then if I do a layer mask here, I'm going to control, what is this? Control invert. So control I, invert the mask. And I'm going to fill the actual layer with black. So let's control backspace. So I get this little kind of like feathered edging to the to this. So I'm going to just save this. So you can build your own alphas. You can download a bunch. I mean, like I said, XMD has a bunch of alphas built into it with a bunch of brush settings. I just want to show you guys how to kind of make your own. Crack. Sweet, sweet crack. Sweet, sweet crack. That's right. You only get that on the streets, folks. Okay. So yeah, if I go back, essentially when I do a custom brush, I usually start with a standard. This will be a drag type, and then I'm going to go to import. So I'll go to my D drive where I've made this. Sweet, sweet crack. And yeah, now I'm going to drag this out. So there are a few issues. First thing is, I think ZBrush may want this to be inverted, so I'm going to try to just inverse this. Or I may do this actually in Photoshop. Let's do that. So I'm going to just hide my layer mask. I'm going to grab a snapshot of everything, which is Alt-Control-Shift-E. So Alt-Control-Shift-E does kind of like a visible snapshot of everything, and then I'll hit Control-I. There we go. And I'll turn the feathering back on, that layer above. Just hit Control-S, and then I should be able to go back to ZBrush. So I'll load the new version of this. There we go. So now I can drag that out. You know, I may still have some, looks like I still have a little bit of issues with the edging here, so I can just go to Alpha if I need to. So if you don't want to do the feathering in Photoshop, or if you just want to bring an image straight in, you can go to Modify. And then there's this thing called Radial Fade. Right, so that gives you kind of like a little softening around the edges. It's almost like a quick masking on the edge. And I'm going to turn down my intensity as well. I find it's like really, yeah. And I'll go to Z sub. There. Now if you still find it, you know, kind of pixelated, again, this could be a limitation or an issue of resolution of the image itself, which is what? It's actually pretty high res. It's 2000 pixels by 2500. You know, it could be that I've gone way too far. I mean, yeah, there might be some jagged pixelation here. So I could do this in Photoshop. I could go to blur this. So I could grab this layer, go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian, and just soften this just a touch, right? But thankfully, ZBrush has an option for this too. So if I've got this alpha active, I can just simply turn up blur here. So usually I'll do that as a way to compensate for maybe bad pixelation. And you know what? That's not terrible. It's not bad. Right, so this is a great way to add cracks. Another thing when it comes to sort of balancing this stuff out is maybe adjusting your intensity a little bit lower if it looks a little too extreme. Or in this case, like I said, this thing is 500,000 polys. I have a feeling this might look better if I divide this mesh one more time. So if I just divide it one more time, yeah, like you can see the quality of this looks a lot better. So there's a combination of factors when it comes to getting detailed alphas to work inside of ZBrush. One is resolution or pixelation in your editing that happens. The second factor is the subdivisions of the mesh. Okay, so let's just zoom back out on this. As a final sort of tip to kind of adding damage and roughness and variation to your surfaces, I'll focus on this this other side. And one thing I'll often do as well is use what's called the surface modifier. It's basically a noise tool. So it's right here, surface. And then we can go to noise. Again, it's got this little preview window, which is, it's a little awkward at times, but oh, yeah, now I lost my object. And unfortunately, you can't frame it. If the object isn't like pivot, if it isn't centered pivot-wise, then it can be hard to get a hold of this thing. But basically the noise, there's a noise scale and a strength, and if I hit OK, I can kind of preview this. So this can add a nice bit of text just to certain parts of your mesh as well. Right? Decay, damage, pitting. You can go to the edit button, and there's this thing called the noise plugin. There's different styles of noise. So there's something like Veron Wah, which is really nice, or turbulence. And if you're not really comfortable with the plugin, what's great about this too, let me just cancel this again. You can actually open up Lightbox. Lightbox has a bunch of presets. So this is really cool. I like this one, which is like a pitted noise. There's also a crack-based noise, which has, I think it's using an alpha basically, as well as some additional roughness. There's brick patterns also. But you can go noise. And let's just hide Lightbox for a second. I'm not sure what's happening with the strength and all that, so I may just play around with the strength setting or the scale. There we go. That's a little better. So it's kind of adding these like broken external sort of chunks as well. It is also giving it a color, so sometimes these things will have color placed on them. I'll just say apply to mesh for now. Yeah, and sometimes you get some really weird results. I should warn you about this too. So sometimes the noise scale preview, when you're in preview mode, it looks great. When you apply it, it's a little too intense. So you may have to go in and dial your strength down a little bit. And then see, apply to mesh. Yeah, it's not so bad. So I'll just take my color slider and switch it back up to white here, so it's a little easier to deal with. So anyways, those are a few, I guess, techniques to show you how to kind of damage your sets and props within your sets.